Greetings and welcome to the Module 1 Unit 9. The unit is concerned with the taxonomy of learning. We looked at in the previous unit 8 the 7 non-technical program outcomes. They address the professional competencies. And designing and conducting instructional activities to facilitate attainment of these 7 outcomes first requires belief in their relevance and considerable group effort by faculty. If you want to do that, because if you look around the engineering programs the way they are conducted, these 7 outcomes are hardly addressed directly. One can justify some indirect addressing of this, but directly PO6 to PO12 are very rarely addressed, in the sense they do not get reflected in the assessment that we perform. The Module 1 Unit 9, the outcomes are: understand that there are mainly 3 domains of learning and all our experiences have elements from all domains. Then describe the structure of Bloom's taxonomy, and particularly we try to understand the cognitive levels, remember and understand of Anderson-Bloom taxonomy. These are the 3 outcomes that we address in this unit. Now once again we will try to repeat what we have stated about learning outcomes. Learning outcomes are what the learners are expected to do at the end of a program, a course or an instructional unit. Now how do we write the outcomes of courses? We have to state the learning outcomes and then conduct instruction to attain these outcomes. But how do we classify outcomes, or how do we write these outcomes? We require a kind of a methodology as well as some terminology for communication between the stakeholders. And when you write outcomes, generally you want a discourse between the 2 or 3 faculty members who are concerned with that particular course. That means whenever you are communicating with each other, first thing that you have to establish that we have a common language to speak. That means any word that you use, it means the same for all. And this is achieved by agreeing to work within one selected taxonomy. And it is also desirable to have the same taxonomy that is applicable to not only learning outcomes but also assessment and teaching. That means within the framework provided by one taxonomy, we should be able to perform all the activities, namely writing outcomes, assessing the student performance and teaching or instruction to facilitate the students to achieve the outcomes. And the outcome statement should have a well defined structure. The structure of the outcome statement, we will take it up in a later unit after we familiarize ourselves with the taxonomy. Now most of the time as a teacher, you are concerned with learning outcomes at the course level. When you want to look at the curriculum design, then we are looking at more at the program outcomes and program specific outcomes and so on. But even at course level, our main concern will be how do I describe my course in terms of course outcomes. But these course outcomes also will be addressing a subset of program outcomes and program specific outcomes. So to that extent, course outcomes have to be related to the POs and PSOs. Now when you write course outcomes, we are also concerned with the instruction and assessment as well, and the issue of alignment between all the three. Because if you write a course outcome for which I cannot easily plan instruction or I cannot easily assess, there is no point in writing a course outcome in that kind of format. Now there are several taxonomies that exist in the literature, even many of them are still practiced. Some of them are Bloom, Solow, Fink, Gagne, Marzano and Kendall, etc. And all these taxonomies are attempts to give a structure to the process involved in learning based on observations of learning behaviors and the limited understanding of how the brain functions. For example, we are far from fully understanding how brain functions and how does it process or how does it learn. First of all, what does learning mean from a brain perspective, and how does it process the information? Is there any structure inside the brain? We have a very limited amount of understanding of how the brain functions, and that is the reason why you end up having several taxonomies. Each taxonomy will look at it from a slightly different perspective. Our focus here is on revised Bloom's taxonomy, which we will presently deal with. Now a little bit of background on Bloom's taxonomy. Benjamin Bloom was working in the early 50s on the development of specifications through which educational objectives, these educational objectives are nothing but learning outcomes, could be organized according to their cognitive complexity. He said, wherever you have learning outcomes, of course their main concern was at the school level, wherever you have these learning outcomes, how do I classify them? For example, will all learning outcomes come under the same category? For example, I ask, one of the outcome is to state some theorem, or another outcome could be the student should be able to solve certain class of problems. Obviously solving a problem, remembering something is not at the same level. So to that extent I have to classify these two are two different ones. And what he has first he said, as an educational psychologist, there are three aspects, namely there is a cognitive dimension or cognitive domain, there is affective domain or a psychomotor domain. These are the three psychological domains which were fairly accepted as three domains at that time by disciplines like psychology or social psychology by 1950s. So first thing he said, any given task that you take favors one of the three psychological domains. That means dominantly any experience will be either dominantly affective or psychomotor. But all the elements of these three domains will be present in any learning experience. And cognitive domain deals with the person's ability to process and utilize information in a meaningful way, what we call references to. You are processing information, or what you call we call it intellect, is a loose word for this, but that is what cognitive domain deals with, processing information. The affective domain relates to the attitudes and feelings that result from or influence the learning process. We all know whenever we are trying to learn something, there are always feelings automatically associated with that. The feelings that we get are dependent on our previous background, and we relate either positively or negatively to a particular learning experience. So, affective domain is always associated with any learning experience. The psychomotor domain involves with manipulative or physical skills. Certain activities will require some physical skills, and in some subjects, if you take theatre or painting, music, the physical skills really are dominant. You have to master the physical skill, acquire the physical skills to perform those activities. So, that is where the Bloom's taxonomy originally started, and because it is actually the taxonomy was proposed in 1956, and since 56, because such a large group of educationists, educational psychologists, neuroscientists, they are all concerned with that, the original Bloom's taxonomy was subjected to tremendous amount of critique, and people did find some reservations about some of the things, and there was a committee that in around 2000 they sat down and looked at the experiences feedback that was given and tried to see whether any modifications need to be done. So, they have slightly revised the Bloom's taxonomy, first of all by labeled and slightly reordered the cognitive levels, for example. And then came the so called they proposed also, while talking about the cognitive domain, they identified that there are two dimensions to cognitive level. One is the cognitive process, the second one is knowledge. You are performing some cognitive activity on some knowledge elements. That is what they have identified, and they converted cognitive domain into a two-dimensional one, namely cognitive level and knowledge categories. Now, this is how the domains of learning can be summarized. You have cognitive, which is has two dimensions, namely cognitive process and knowledge categories. You have affective domain, which concerns with the emotion, and then third one is psychomotor, and all three dimensions are involved to varying degrees in all intended learning experiences and activities. There is no way you can say that one is totally absent. If one wants to complete this, you can also add spiritual domain, but in our module we are not going to be dealing with spiritual domain. Just for completion, we can add this dimension called spiritual. Now, as we mentioned, the original taxonomy, Bloom's taxonomy, Bloom, of course he was a chairman of a committee that came out with, but it the last 60-70 years it goes with the name of as Bloom's taxonomy. And in 1956, that is a book, it is popularly known as handbook, that was published, and then a major revision of this Bloom's taxonomy appeared in 2001. It is presented by Anderson, Crothwall and several other authors. The title of the book is A Taxonomy for Learning, Teaching and Assessment. This I consider a very important book, that if you are working within the modified or Anderson Bloom's taxonomy, this is a very, very important book to have or access to this book. And this revised taxonomy is now referred to as Anderson Bloom taxonomy. Now, we can look at the experiences are really integrated. They are not really isolated experience. If you look at these two pictures, you have everything in this. There is cognitive, there is obviously phenomenal amount of affective, that emotion that is involved, and then certainly you have physical skills. So, one can say these represent truly integrated experiences. A dance like that, or a performing a performing artist will kind of have these integrated experiences. And one can look at dominantly cognitive. That means you somehow pay less and less attention to the other two, but these represent kind of a dominantly cognitive experiences. You can also consider this as dominantly affective. The main thing that you can see through these pictures is expressing and demonstrating emotion and affection towards each other. And then this is dominantly psychomotor. Here you require extremely high end skills, though you can say you cannot say that there is no cognitive dimension to this. There is. Exactly what to do at what time is a cognitive decision, but the dominance is to perform any of these activities you require extreme psychomotor skills. Sometimes you, in a given experience, you will go through various experiences in a limited period. For example, in a 19-minute exam, if you have maybe first 85 minutes you are dominantly cognitive, but then the last 5 minutes can be quite emotional and go into a bit of affective domain if you are not happy with what you were doing earlier. Okay. So, you can have changing domains also. Now, the cognitive processes that we have as proposed by Anderson Bloom are remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate and create. As you can see, these are practically you can say action verbs. They are representative of action, because that is the way we require, because outcome is stated as, outcome is what the student should be able to do. So, here what is the doing? You are remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating and creating. This is what you are doing. So, these represent really action verbs. And it is also accepted there is certain kind of hierarchy. Hierarchy in the sense, understand activity involves remembering, can involve remembering. Apply activity will involve or likely to involve understand and remember both. Similarly, analyze will involve apply, understand and remember. And the highest one is create, can involve all the other 5 activities. So, there is a kind of a hierarchy that is involved. Hierarchy does not mean higher difficulty levels. We will come to that at a later point. Somehow in the literature, higher level activity is considered automatically more difficult, which is not true. Okay, let us look at remember. That is the most what you call lowest level activity you can say. Remembering is retrieving relevant knowledge from the long term memory. Okay. That is, you have remembered something or you have put something in the memory, and you are required to recall it whenever you want, because you cannot each time, any time say 2 into 2 equal to 4, the answer should come from the long term memory rather than trying to solve it as a mathematical problem. What is 2 and 2, what is meant by multiplication, what is meant by 2, you are not going through that logic. So, what happens for anyone to function adequately in any area of endeavor, you have to store lot of information and you should be able to readily retrieve. The relevant knowledge may be factual, like what is the density of water. Okay. You do not want to go and consult a handbook, that is a factual information. And there should be conceptual knowledge, like what is meant by mass. I am not going to keep going and consulting. I should know that kind of a concept. Then procedural knowledge, that is, how do you calculate, how do you multiply, how do you add. These are procedural knowledge that needs to be remembered, and it can be a combination of any of these. So, remembering knowledge is essential for meaningful learning and problem solving, and you have to keep loading a lot of information, but it cannot stop there. So, this is the lowest level activity and we require to remember many things. Now, how do I associate a verb that signifies remembering? So, we use action verbs to indicate a remember type of activity, a recognize, recall, a list, tell, locate, write, find, mention, state, draw, label, define, name, describe, or even prove a theorem. These are some of the action verbs that you can use. One may want to add a few more depending based on your experience, but the main thing is you have stored something in the memory and you have to perform an activity that will involve in bringing from a long term memory to your present conscious state. So, that is the activity that is involved in remembering. Now, some sample activities which we will state in the form of let us say a kind of a problem statement, what you can ask in an assessment. State and prove the condition for maximum efficiency of a transformer. Okay, one is stating and the second one is proving the condition for maximum efficiency, that there is a method of computing maximum efficiency is presented and you have to prove that. Proof is already given to the student, and here you are not calculating, please remember that you are not calculating the efficiency, you are only proving the condition for maximum efficiency. Both are presented to you earlier, you have to recall them and write. So, all these examples are the same, similar. What is the importance of automatic generation control in a power system? What is the importance? That is what you are, it will see later. You are only stating the importance, it is presented to you earlier, you are remembering. Describe the failure and remedial measures of flexible payments. Prove that lost power is proportional to entropy generation rate in the fluid flow in an open system. It may sound quite complex and profound, but what you are doing is proving that lost power is proportional to entropy is only recalling. State the assumptions of working stress method and limit state method in connection with the design of concrete structures. You are stating the assumptions. Draw the stress strain curves for concrete in compression under ideal test conditions and laboratory test conditions. This is also you are drawing, it has been already shown to you, you are just reproducing the curves. So, these are the sample activities for remember, and you can also produce more questions by using these stems, what happened after, and you can fill the gap, how many, again who was it that who stated something, can you name the, or describe what happened at, who spoke to, what is the meaning of, what is. So, these are, whenever you want to write any assessment items for a particular unit that you are dealing with, learning unit you are dealing with, you can have these as the what do you call starting point for writing your assessment items. Now, come to the major another very important, slightly more obviously more complex than remember. Understand, now there is also, when you look from the old taxonomy of Bloom's taxonomy, the first taxonomy, understand is a word is almost had a derogatory meaning. So, people who work with original Bloom's taxonomy, they do not like this word. The word they use is comprehend. But after a lot of feedback coming from all over the world, the group decided to come back to the word understand. Understanding is constructing meaning from instructional messages. The instructional messages can be verbal, that is somebody speaking, or it can be pictorial or graphic or symbolic in terms of equations. And instructional messages are received during lectures, to demonstrations, field trips, performances or simulations, in books or in computer or on computer monitor. So, the instructional messages can come from any of these sources, and I need to construct meaning from these messages. For example, at present you are listening to something which is a verbal, and possibly you are seeing on a monitor or a cell phone, and you have to construct meaning from those instructional messages. That is understanding. Now, understanding has fairly large number of sub processes involved in understanding. So, there are 7 that are listed here. Let us quickly go through this. Interpret. Interpretation means translating into your own words or paraphrasing or represent or clarify. For example, something is presented to you, you can be asked a question, clarify what is being stated in that, or translate it in your own language, or paraphrase in your own words. These are interpretation. That is what is called the earlier what we are trying is construct a message out of what is presented to you. Now, next is exemplify. That means something is presented to you, you illustrate, some theorem is presented to you, you give an illustration or instantiate something out of that. Give an example. Okay. Exemplification is nothing but giving an example. Classify. Classification is categorization or subsuming one into something else. How do you categorize? Summarize. Summarization is more like generalization or abstracting. Something maybe elaborate or complex is presented to you, you convert, let us say, verbal description into a mathematical form, that is abstract form, that is that is one way of summarization. Then you are inferring something. In whatever you are presented, you are finding a pattern. You are inferring that the elements of what is presented are related in one particular way. Or you are comparing, contrast, match and map, you are comparing two different knowledge elements, and then the purpose is only comparing what are the advantages and disadvantages of A and B, or in what way A differs from B. So, that is the type of questions that you would ask. And sometimes you just explain. For example, we come across many such questions in our tests and examinations. Construct a model. It could be a verbal model or a mathematical model. In whatever way you are explaining something. So, these are the 7 sub processes that we are involved. Some sample activities, if you look at, explain why in a DC machine flux per pole decreases with increase in load. Compare the memory map DIVO and peripheral map DIVO techniques. Explain the use of virtual base class. And sample questions, as you can see, like write in your own words. This is a stem that you can use, and with respect to your subject, I am sure you can generate several questions of that type. Write a brief outline. What do you think could happen next? What do you think? What was the main idea? Who was the key character in what, let us say in a given drama or in a literature piece. Distinguish between, what differences exist between, provide an example of what you mean. So, these are some of the stems that you can use in writing questions representing understanding in your assessment. Now, what we would like you to do as assignments, give 2 examples of activities from the course you taught or learned that belong to the cognitive levels of remember and understand. You are required to give 2 examples, but they truly should belong to those 2 categories. Now, as an exercise to say that Anderson-Bloom taxonomy is not unique and other taxonomies are also followed by some people, but to appreciate that, compare Anderson-Bloom taxonomy with another taxonomy of your choice. Write some kind of a statement why they are to what extent they are common or to what extent they differ and why do they differ. And after this we go into the unit 10. Mainly the unit 10 will focus on understanding the remaining 4 cognitive levels: apply, analyze, evaluate and create of Anderson-Bloom taxonomy. That is the goal of this. Thank you very much for your attention.